Hello, Dr. Moyen. My name is Mary Grace Payne, and I am a graduate student here at the University of South Carolina in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program.
And I'm Robin Cranmer. I'm also a graduate student in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program.
Great. Nice to meet you all.
Today, we are discussing Chapter 5, Redefining Reform, Presidents, Football, and Athletic Policy in the Southeastern Conference, within the book, The History of American College Football, Institutional Policy, Culture, and Reform. So, Dr. Moyen, we are really looking forward to talking to you about the chapter that you have written. And first and foremost, please introduce yourself, tell us about your background, and kind of where your inspiration and interest in the founding of the Southeastern Conference originated.
Sure. So my name's Eric Moyen, and I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. I grew up literally a couple hundred yards from the experiment station farm on UK's campus. Um, and in the early 70s, they built their football stadium on that farm. And so I grew up, I mean, literally 6, 7 years old, selling lemonade to people parking all over our neighborhood as they went to football games. And then at halftime, the K Club guys who took the tickets at halftime, they let me in the game and I'd go watch football there. So I grew up in an SEC town and really was a big fan of UK and sports in general. And when I went away to college, I went to a small liberal arts school in Indiana, Taylor University. First semester, fell in love with higher ed, came home, and over Christmas, over winter break, told my parents I want to spend the rest of my life on a college campus. I just didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. So I enrolled in a master's program in history at the University of Alabama. And so, sorry, my light turns off here automatically if I don't move. Um, and so I studied history at Alabama. So then I returned to Lexington, taught high school for a couple of years, knowing that that wasn't going to last long, and started to look for, I didn't know if I wanted to do history or if I wanted to do education. And it turned out that one of the leading scholars in the field of history of higher ed, John Phelan, was at the University of, and still is at the University of Kentucky. This is perfect. So I finished my PhD at UK. I took his higher ed and athletics class. Wish I had thought about it more at the time, really focusing on that. Focused on a bunch of history of policy issues in my dissertation. And then my academic interest in the SEC really grew when, after finishing my PhD 17 years ago, that's flown by, I wrote a biography of a guy named Frank McVeigh. He's considered the university founder of the University of Kentucky, although they had had a few presidents before. And the institutional founder, his name was William Patterson. He really ran a college. McVeigh came in 1917 and helped UK become a university. And when he took over in 1917, and I bet South Carolina is about the same. Actually, South Carolina has a longer history, so maybe it was a little larger. But in 1917, there were about 1,000 students on campus. And by the time he retired in the early 40s, they had 6,000 students in doc programs and a much expanded campus. And I had no idea, but he was the founding president of the Southeastern Conference. The other presidents named him president, and he was very much interested in curbing big time athletics. And so that's when I thought this is something I would really like to study more about. So that's a little bit about me.
Perfect. So, just going into some of the things about the SEC, for those that might be watching this that don't know anything about the SEC, could you tell us just a quick summary of the founding of the Southeastern Conference and then kind of go into some of the reforms that they made?
Sure. So one of the early on in the 1890s, a guy at Vanderbilt, Professor Dudley, founded what was the Southern Intercollegiate Athletics Association. and it was the first regional association. The Big Ten, what was known as the Western Conference, was founded a year later. The SIAA grew, and as it expanded, some of the larger schools at the time decided to form what was known as the Southern Conference. And the big issue between the two, the really small schools wanted to play freshmen, because if you had a student body of 300 students, your incoming classes are not that large and you don't have many people to field a football team. It was the larger schools, the big schools, with 1,000 students, who thought that freshmen should not play varsity athletics, that they should acclimate to college life first. And so those two groups separated, and the Southern Conference became the group of what were large schools at the time. It still included schools like Sewanee and VMI, and trying to think of some of the smaller schools that were in there. But Furman may have been in there, Duke, which was Trinity College in the first few years before they got their huge endowment in the mid 1920s. So there were a lot of state schools, some leading private institutions, and the association grew really, really large. It went from Maryland all the way through Louisiana. There were over 20 institutions. And so there was a lot of discussion in that of, hey, let's get a smaller conference, because none of the problems in early athletics had been, well, I shouldn't say none. The quote unquote tramp athlete had kind of ended. That was a kid who would go from school to school and play football. One week they'd show up at Vandy and play in a game, and then the next week they're at South Carolina or Georgia playing. They had managed to get rid of that. But in terms of standards and following the rules, not a lot of schools had done that. So within the Southern Conference, there was a small group of administrators and professors. The leader of that was a guy named John Tigert, who was the president at the University of Florida. And he wanted to see a smaller conference where they could really enforce academic standards. And so he met with and spent a lot of time corresponding with other administrators and faculty at Georgia Tech and at Vandy. Kentucky was included in that group because he had been a faculty member at Kentucky and knew Frank McVeigh and his seriousness about athletics. But if you've studied presidents at all, they're very interested in politics and very interested in image and not wanting to tarnish their own or not wanting to harm others. And so what started as a small reform group really became rather controversial in the Southern Conference, as other presidents found out or other faculty members found out and said, hey, you're saying you're going to form this conference that's going to really impose standards. We think our standards at the University of Virginia are better than your standards. Who are you to say this? And so what ended up happening, to avoid any image problems, is that the Southeastern Conference in late 32, they decided to, it was, the Constitution came in 1933, but at a Southern Conference meeting in 1932, they decided to separate along geographical lines. So if you think about trying to get to different schools, the Appalachian Mountains posed a real problem. Trying to drive from where I am in Mississippi to Virginia, you're going to have to go through the mountains. So they separated those east and west. The Southern Conference remained on the eastern side of the mountains. The Southeastern remained on the western side, and most of the Southern Conference schools are now, it was the foundation of what became the ACC. So that's a little bit about the founding.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for rehashing the founding of that. All of that is so interesting. And we had a great time reading that. One thing too, we would like to talk about a little bit is the controversial reforms that the SEC proposed that kind of fundamentally changed the nature of collegiate athletics. So could you give us a little synopsis of those reforms regarding scholarships to athletes? And also, how do you think collegiate athletics would would have changed, if at all, if the NCAA had adopted these proposals in 1936.
So and it's really nuanced, and it was a difficult thing to, not thing, theme or idea to try and express in the chapter, which is redefining reform. Someone would really have to study a lot of the primary source documents in the early 20th century, from the founding of the NCAA, and actually before the founding in 1906, all the way up through the 30s. Anytime almost any administrator or professor talked about reform, they were talking about curbing abuses in athletics, and they were talking about the fact that players were receiving subsidies, whether it was from the university or alumni just agreeing to pay for people to come. They were talking about recruiting, and reform meant getting rid of those things. And what I kind of argue in this is, hey, we might want to start looking at reform in a different lens, which is maybe the reform kind of, and it ties in with what we're dealing with today in policy and higher ed and athletics with name, image, likeness debates, is that the early use of reform is not the correct term. That was really conservation of let's try and keep this thing amateur, and just for the love of the game. And that's all we're concerned about, rather than saying, okay, we have all these problems, let's create a reform. And I argue that the Southeastern Conference, which is the first conference to recognize athleticism as a reason to give a quote unquote scholarship, or if academics don't like that term because it might denote really high academic standards, would a grant and aid. You could get a grant and aid because you're a really, really good athlete. And after 3 years of attempting to, at the beginning of the SEC, to be really pure and not have scholarships and not recruit players and not use training tables, meaning special cafeterias where athletes could eat, and not scouting and all of these things, John Tigert, who became the second president after Frank McVeigh failed miserably, right? Schools, just like they had been for decades, continued to fund players, continued to recruit, continued to push big time football. And Tigert comes along and says, hey, maybe we should start being honest about what we're doing and allow athleticism to play a role in this. And so, with regard to how would it, so when the SEC did that, the other conferences, especially the Big Ten, really freaked out and said it was going to ruin college athletics. And that, I mean, they're in the 40s, everything gets put on hold during World War II, but in the 40s, there's actually an attempt to, and 40s and early 50s, to kick out schools that are offering any scholarships, and that doesn't work. And of course, in the mid 50s, the NCAA finally recognizes these aren't going away. And so it's weird to think of the SEC as being progressive in any way. But if you think about it in terms of the debate today, the Southeastern Conference really was at the forefront of trying to say, hey, maybe there's some reason to, give scholarships to good athletes who help institutions.
Thank you so much for going into all of that. Those are all of the pre-planned questions that we have. If you have anything else that you'd like to say for those that might watch this, feel free, but that's all that we plan to ask.
I don't think so. As you can tell, I like talking about. I've gone way over my allotted time. I'm so
No,
sorry. Class, whoever watches this, I'm sorry. I hope I don't keep you after. So,
no, we're interested. She and I both are SEC graduates, so we love this stuff. We eat it up.
all right. Well, thank you all.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Moyen. Thank you for your time.